So, as Cameron said, strap yourselves in. This is going to be a wild ride. There's a lot to cover in this talk. It's a geodynamic overview, so it's the context of the foundation formation that the Stavely Arc was erupted onto, whether it's autochthonous or loxodonous, whether it belongs to the Gondwana-margin, it's 500 million years old, or whether it's exotic or both. And also a lot of stuff's happened to it afterwards, and that's been a really significant challenge for explorers looking into the Arc. You don't get to do this sort of work in a terrain like this by yourself. So obviously a few partners in crime, like David Taylor in particular, have been working here for an awfully long time trying to understand it, probably from the middle 1990s. And we're just starting to get a bit familiar with it now, I reckon. We've got to acknowledge our sort of collaborators, especially from Geoscience Australia. It's been great to pull those guys in for a diversity of extra skill sets to bring to bear. Certainly in my case, geochemistry is not my strong suit. So the talk outline, briefly just go through the regional setting, why we think there might be an arc there and what other people have thought about it, outline and critique of the sort of previous Stavely Arc models proposed for the area. I'll up front give you what we think is our preferred model. It's a sort of Cordilleran style with a few changes, sort of arc on the Gondwana-margin. And then I'm going to tell you why we've had to come to that conclusion. There's a lot of constraints that demand that as a single solution, really. Once we've got confidence in the setting, I'll step you through what we think is a 4D time sequence for the Cambrian Ordovician Victoria, and then I'll introduce a little bit of what we think has happened to it afterwards, but I'll expand on that in a separate talk, and there's some conclusions. So moving right along, obviously this is Australia, and this is the bit we're going to be really talking about today, but specifically the western part of the state, where the oldest rocks are in the state, and obviously that's the Cambrian Stavely Zone, and the southern part's where it's exposed. So this southern western part of Victoria is the focus of a lot of our attention. There are outcrops of it, and some of them are quite fresh. There was a marine incursion in over the area that only were left about 6 or 7 million years ago. So the upstanding bits that weren't eroded flat in that marine incursion have had all their regoliths stripped off, and they're really quite fresh. So Mount Stavely is obviously where some of these rocks were first recognised as interesting volcanic rocks in 1870 by a guy called Ferdinand Krauser, obviously a very good geologist, that guy. His map looks much like the modern map, really. It was amazing. And another really significant area in the Black Range, and this is where all the sort of minerals prospects have been found over the subsequent years. So a lot of the focus is really understanding the context of these rocks and how they may relate to other rocks in the area. There's a little outcrop near Lake Bolac. This is one at Mount Dryden. You can have a look at some of the rocks. You can see a nice volcanic breccia there. It looks really fresh, quite low metamorphic grade. It's got a little younger granite underneath it, so it's a little bit of a hornfells, that one. Here's another one at Mount Elliot, again quite fresh, cut a thin section of it. This one's an andesite. The only thing that's really happened to this rock is the glass matrix has devitrified sometime in the last 500 million years. You'd be forgiven for saying nothing's really much has happened to these rocks, and that's true in a way because the metamorphic grade's low, but they've been ships in the night. They've moved around quite a lot, and that's made it hard to understand the porphyry setting. So there's the boundaries of the region we're interested in. The Mawson Fault on the east and the Yarra Mildred Fault on the west. More or less all the rocks which have real arc character that we've determined from outcrop and from drilling are really confined into that region. So the rocks to the east tend to be older volcanics, and they've got sort of mid-ocean ridge basalt and or back arc basin affinities, but not really related to this particular arc. And the rocks to the west, they're sort of both rift and sort of back arc type volcanics in there, and just a hint of some arc magmatism, which is important, and we'll talk about that later on. Because there's so much cover, it's hard to see what's going on, so geophysics really comes to the party. So we've got a really good gravity network here, average station spacing of about 1.5 kilometres. So this is where we bring some of our sort of geophysics wizardists in to manipulate this data and make it really sing for us, and they've done a fantastic job with that. It's especially powerful when you combine different techniques. So as well as the gravity, we've got obviously high quality magnetic data, average sort of station line spacing of about 250 metres for this part of the world, infill down to 50 metres in places, which is really important. And again, you can process it to bring out all sorts of information. It allows us to take the surface into the unknown, and that's the fault boundaries there. So you can see there's a lot of stuff going on in there. Quite a bit of it isn't the arc, and quite a bit of it is, and working out which is which has been a real challenge, and that's what we've been working on for the last 4 years. Previous models. So these are the sort of models you can have in convergent systems at sort of continental scale. You can have island arcs where you have an oceanic crust sinking under oceanic crust, you get interoceanic arc. You can have a Cordilleran sort of system where the oceanic crust is sinking under the margin of a continent, building an arc on the margin. You have an arc-continent collision where you have ocean dipping subduction and it pulls an island arc in and it crashes, and you can have full-on sort of continent-continent collision where you have basically the ocean closes completely and continents collide. And what's challenging for Stavely is all of these have been applied to Stavely and more over the years, all by experts in their field. The experts can't agree, and combined with the poor exposure, this has made it really difficult on the prospectivity. People just don't know what they're looking for. And we're in that field as well. Some people don't even think it's an arc. So this is really challenging. So a brief history, I'll just go through the main ones. There's been literally dozens proposed, but there's been some really key shapers and movers. And Tony Crawford is in the audience. He's one of the main sort of contenders here. Crawford and Keys 1981, Cordillera sort of margin. So basically a subduction zone dipping under the eastern margin of Gondwana, building an arc. And then Erwin Scheib, the New South Wales geologist, very good geologist, he proposed a continent-continent collision with an ocean-dipping subduction zone, and he had the Victorian microcontinent to the east of the Stavely Arc. That's what VM stands for there. And basically, ocean-dipping subduction drew that microcontinent in, it collided with Gondwana. And then this was quite strongly influenced by Tasmania. We proposed much of the same thing, except we had it as a continent sort of island arc collision, so this is like a Taiwan-style collision. Some of you will probably notice there's some weird things in that cartoon, like, for example, the lower plate's hot and the upper plate isn't. That's a bit weird. But we sort of stepped around that because a lot of the other data seemed to fit, and it fitted quite well with Tasmania, where Tony had changed his mind now, and the Stavely volcanics weren't an arc anymore. They were a post-collisional rift succession, and that was based on correlations with the Mount Reid volcanics in Tassie, and it was a pretty good model they had there. It was a hybrid sort of model, similar to the one we adopted in 2000. And so you had an early ophiolite placement and then late magmatism with sort of arc-type signatures over the top. Subsequent to that, some additional work's been done that sort of led to John Foden and John Miller and a few others proposing a sort of hybrid rifted Cordillera sort of model where it looked like it was continent dipping again, and maybe it was an arc. And partly that was based on some work that Tony Kemp had done in his PhD when he found these sort of bononitic sanucatoid type melts within the Glenelg metamorphic complex, which are about the same age as the Stavely volcanics, but much further west. And those sorts of rocks have to be in a super-subduction zone setting, so it tells you it's a continent-dipping subduction zone again. And that's sort of what we were finding with the seismic as well. So we were looking at the geometries revealed by the deep seismic, and we thought, yeah, this looks like an Andean sort of system, except we weren't actually sure if the arc that we imaged by the seismic was even the Stavely volcanics. And so we actually initially gave it a separate name just to be on the safe side, but we've changed our mind now. We've firmed up our story that the Stavely Arc is actually that arc. So now I'll tell you why. But first, we'll go through one of the other models and just show you why they put it together, how it works through time, and then we can do a critique of it. So this is the oceanic arc, sort of arc-continent collision model, and the one we advocated in 2000, and other people have advocated it since then as well. So you basically have a subduction zone dipping towards the continent, you're pulling an arc in, you're building an accretionary wedge in front of it, all smashes back into the margin of Gondwana. Great big complicated deformational event like the Taiwan sort of style collision. And then in this model, what happens next is that you get a subduction flip and it becomes continent dipping. So now it looks kind of Andean, but it's got this early history to the west. And this explains a few cool things. So it predicts a few things. It predicts early island arc bononite and then late sort of calcareocline andesite, perhaps an Andean setting, and that fits the data we've got. It predicts island arc accretion related shortening to the west of the arc. And actually, we don't really see that, so that's a bit of a cross there. It also predicts early high temperature metamorphism, which will be the back arc, east of the arc, and we don't really see that either. And it predicts late heating and extension, superimposed over thrusting and accretion to the west of the arc, and we don't see that. The accretion occurs after the subduction flip, we do see that, so that's okay. But it also predicts that the arc and the stuff it's sitting on should be completely exotic to the Gondwana-margin, so we shouldn't be able to correlate in stratigraphy, and we can. So that's a cross. Lake arc shortening is okay, but it would mean it would be a second generation structures, and we don't see that. So there's clearly some problems here, so that's why we've gone to our preferred model. I'll give you it up front, this is what we think is happening, and then the rest of the talk is really telling about why we think it's that way. So what we think happened instead is it started off much the same. It was a passive margin, a hyperextended margin, on the east coast of Gondwana, related to Rhydinia breakup, which had started about 750, 800 million years ago, and went through to about 650, opened the Pacific Ocean, and then it started to subduct once it got old, and that subduction initiated on the margin, and it was initially bononitic because it was primitive and immature, and then as it matured, it went into calcareocline, and it was a Japan-style system, and it went into rollback, and you've got high temperature metamorphism in the back arc. And then, because it was accreting a microcontinent further south, it went into flat-out subduction, so it shifted to an Andean-style system, jammed that hot back arc shut, and it superimposed some thrust structures over the top, and deformed the arc. And then the subduction sort of went extinct because it jumped outboard to the Macquarie Arc, and we got a pulse of magmatism, and that's mineralised. And then there's a bunch of other stuff related to the Tasman Fold Belt, superimposed over the top. And this predicts a bunch of stuff, and it gets a big tick for all of them, as far as we can tell so far. So that's why we're going for it. So now I'll talk you through why we're doing it that way. Okay, so this area is actually bigger than the project area for Stavely, because we wanted to capture some of the northern parts, which are under really deep cover, probably not going to be explored anytime soon, mostly. But nevertheless, obviously a big magnetic thing is still important to include in the story, because we wanted to understand as much of the system as we could. So you'll get very familiar with this area in both my talks, and sometimes I'll be talking about the smaller project area. So the important thing about it is, this is the magnetic data, that's the tilt filter data. It's really high quality data, and because we've got these magnetic markers in the bedrock, it's possible to actually sort of pick up where they're chopped up and offset and displaced. So there's a lot of faults in there. Those black squares are really key points I'll be talking about in the second talk, so they're not relevant for this one. But zooming into the central bit, this is the area where we've got some natural exposure and a lot of cover. Back to our little line there. To understand that magnetic data better, we shot some seismic. I'll talk about it in the 3 different stages. I'll start with talking about what happens to the east of the arc, because this is important because it helps understand the arc subduction polarity when the arc was forming. So as it happens, this tees into some work that David Taylor and I did when we were mapping in the Ararat-Stawell region, trying to understand the Stawell goldfield back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. This is one of the maps we produced. So this is a geological interpretation of aeromagnetic data in this one, but it's a good template for trying to explain what's going on here, and it's quite cool in terms of the result. So that's Ararat for reference, the town. Stawell's a long strike to the north. So at Stawell, you see sort of Morb, back arc basin, sort of high, sort of early Cambrian basalts, and they're submarine basalts, and they've got chert on top of them and black shale, and they're clearly in a sort of quiescent intra-oceanic environment for a long time. And you can see pillows in there. They're a bit flattened now, but it was clearly a submarine system. And those rocks are quite low grade. Obviously the pillows are barely altered, and the green schist low green schist facet is there. Those same rocks become increasingly metamorphosed as you head west towards Stavely. So by the time you get 15 kilometres west, the volcanics are almost unrecognisable. They're now a hornblende amphibolite schist, and they're also really complicatedly deformed and smashed up right down to even thin section scale. And you can sort of see the map to the right, the map scale there at a sort of about 200,000 scale is almost the same pattern as the outcrop there. The volcanics are all mixed up with the sediments, which used to be deposited on top. Looks a bit like an accretionary complex. You cut a thin section of it, you can see there's the metamorphic assemblages there, sort of hornblende, garnet, all that sort of stuff. And you can use those assemblages to give you a pressure temperature, and basically the rocks at the eastern side at Stawell are from 4 kilobars, and these ones are sort of 9 kilobars, and almost 600 degrees, almost melting, but not quite. These rocks are coming from 30 kilometres down, and there's a consistent variation through the belt from east to west. And then those really high temperature, high pressure rocks are faulted out against the zone that's got the Stavely Arc in it. And the immediate rocks, there's the fault, it's exposed. So the rocks in the hanging wall there are from 9 kilobars, and the rocks in the footwall are from about 2 or 3 kilobars locally, up to 4 elsewhere, but quite low pressure here. This is a very big change across this fault. It's a vertical throw of almost 30 or 28 kilometres or something. And some other intermediate metamorphism is further out in the complex. And what's significant about it is that now that John Miller at Melbourne Uni and his co-workers are able to date the age of that high pressure metamorphism, it's 500 million years old. So it's the same age as the Stavely Arc. That's pretty cool. So because of the mapping we'd done, Dave and I, and the geophysics we had at the time, which was the magnetics mainly and the gravity, especially the mapping though, we're able to draw a cross-section across it, and this is what we thought was happening. And using sensor shear indicators this is a thin section of one of the myelonites in one of the pelitic schists in there, we're able to work out what the transport directions were, and basically it's a divergent system, sort of verging west in the west and east in the east, and the metamorphic grades sort of getting higher and higher towards the west. So it's time to test that idea. So this was part of the reason why we put seismic through here. It's an area of good control, and we also thought we had a pretty cool cross-section that was pretty definitive in shape, and we wanted to test that. So this was part of the 2009 survey. There's a result. Just to save time, I'll show you all the fault names. They've all got names already because they're all outcrop. We'd all mapped them all already and we'd measured them. And what's cool is it looks just like the cross-section you get from mapping. So it gives you confidence that seismic's seeing things that are real and that mapping's actually works. And magnetics works. It's all sort of working and selling from the common song sheet. And so with that confidence, we're able to sort of go to the areas where there's really poor exposure. The last little thing about this, which I want to point out, is that one of the things we found when we were mapping and didn't understand at the time is that there's sedimentary recycling from the metamorphic complex, really distinctly high pressure, high temperature mineralisation in class being reworked into the very turbidites that have been drawn into the system. So that looks like an accretionary wedge. It's a classic melange. So the overall geometry, the melange that you see in there, the intermixing of stuff structurally and the recycled character is of a type 1 accretionary wedge backstop above a west dipping slab, and we published that years ago, but we didn't have full confidence that the subduction was how it related to the rocks further west. Okay, so the seismic lines. They go further west into the Cambrian Stavely Zone, and then they go west of the Stavely Zone into the back arc. So zooming in on the seismic, Cameron's already introduced it, so I won't dwell on it anymore. This is the bit where we did the mapping, so we've got a good result there. We've got an accretionary wedge there. And then to the west of it, we've got these outcrops of calc-alkaline rocks. And then to the west of that, we've got the Yarra-Milgit Fault, which bounds the western side of that terrain. Looking at these rocks, this is geochemistry. I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but all the samples we've got, and that's some legacy data and new drilling we've done, shows marked depletion of niobium relative to lanthanum and potassium, and that's a key characteristic of subduction-related arc magmas. So the whole rock geochemistry looks like a continental arc. This is the age of the arc. It's sort of towards the end, it's about 500 million years, but it goes back to 511 plus, and this is new geochronology we did through this Stavely project, and it's really good to push the age of the arc back a bit, trying to understand the older history, and these dates are from inside the Cambrian Stavely Zone. To the west of the arc, we've got this sort of the Glenelg Zone, this high temperature metamorphic complex, and it's got a mix of rift and arc and sort of back arc geochemistry in there. We want to understand that because we can trace those Glenelg Zone rocks into South Australia, and this is where the wider context of the arc comes along. So looking at a little bit of the Glenelg Zone, here's a map that we did in 2003. Again, it's had the younger rocks stripped off to show the bedrock. It's all folded. So it outcrops quite well in the creeks, and you can see there's a single generation of upright convergence structures. So in this instance, they're superimposed over a metamorphic, high temperature metamorphic schist. So it's highly heat. It's a very hot metamorphic complex, but it's not very high pressure. You even get folds superimposed over the foliatic granites, and they're also upright. So there's this single generation of really tight folds superimposed over the high temperature metamorphism. And we know because of the metamorphic character, where the grade sits, it's much lower pressure than the accretionary wedge to the east, but it's hotter. So it's actually partially melted, so mostly migmatite. We've got some ages. And there's a couple of peaks in this one. One of them is the primary magmatic age, about 514. This is one of the oldest ones we've got locally for the actual metamorphism in the metamorphic complex in the back arc. And so we reworked around 485 and mainly reworked about 500. So we've got a bit of age there. So basically we've got high pressure Barovian-style metamorphism to the east. We've got high temperature Basin-style metamorphism to the west. And in between we've got an active calc-alkaline Stavely Arc. And this is kind of diagnostic of a paired metamorphic complex, and this is something John Miller pointed out in 2005. So it looks like this would all be consistent with the subduction zone going down the chute throughout that entire period, from 514 to 495. So at least sort of 15, maybe 20 million years. So we'd say the Stawell Zone is the accretionary wedge, it's cold, and the Glenelg Zone is a hot inverted back arc basin. So when you have these sorts of systems, a back arc basin on a continental setting, it's going to be superimposed over something else. What do we know about that? Well, we've got some extra data, and that's what the red dot is. So go back to the same map. Here it is. So this is zircon and crystallisation age in a sill, intruding sediments in the western Glenelg Zone, quite low-grade parts, so it hasn't really shown any overprinting effects later on. This is really significant because this is a lot older than other rocks dated here, 642. These are some of the rocks that the back arc was superimposed over the top of. If you draw a cross-section of it, you can see there's, just like in the outcrops, there's a single generation of folds from all the mapping we've done there. This is quite well exposed in some creeks there. And that's the context of this 642 folded sill. So basically what this tells us is that the convergent event that deformed the Stavely Arc is the only convergent deformation event in Western Victoria since at least 642. And when we look at rocks below those 642 million year sills and sediments, we see serpentinite. It's a peridotite. It's a bit of the mantle. And it's got extensional shear fabrics in it. So there's SC fabrics there. And this is an earlier extensional event that predates 642 because we're not seeing this in those younger 642 million year sediments. So the model that George Gibson put forward when we came up with a similar sort of model is that the mantle peridotite was exhumed to the seafloor during Rodinia breakup, and then it had these Neoproterozoic to Cambrian sediments conformably stuck on top. I think that is a simple story that makes sense. So once we have these links, it allows us to start drawing correlations into really established stratigraphy in South Australia. So those 642 age is really significant because it's time equivalent to the Umbratana group in South Australia. So that's actually older than the Wilpena group, and the Wilpena group's the Flinders Ranges. So this is stuff sitting underneath that, and it's in Western Victoria, and it's part of our Backup Basin basement. We also see serpentinites like the hummocks turning up in fault slices in the Stavely Arc. So the Stavely Arc's got this exotic stuff in it faulted in, and they look like mantle peridotites too. And we can't do much with them, they're very depleted, but the most sensible thing to do with them is to correlate them with the hummock serpentinite because Western Victoria is the only place we see them. And how else do you get mantle peridotite to the surface in big continuous fault slices? Looking at the seismic, we've got this South Australian connection, and it's better than just drawing bows with age dates. We've actually got some more seismic, bit of a data gap. We can bridge that. We can trace structures through from the lower crust on our new seismic into some of this legacy petroleum seismic done in South Australia. And it gives us a tool for sort of projecting west some of the big bland, not very dense bits that we've got in the mid and lower crust of Stavely which aren't exposed to the surface in South Australia to see what they are, and they pop out in the Adelaide Fold Thrust Belt. They're Palaeoproterozoic crystalline inliers of the Gawler Craton. So this is the basis for us extrapolating Gawler Craton back into our section line as that brown unit. And we see that in the western part of the back arc. But there's also this fault called the Apsley Fault, and that looks extensional. So that's cut through this big unreflective package and moved a part of it east, and presumably the rest headed off to Laurentia. And so this is a method for us propagating that bits of the Gawler Craton back as a continental ribbon underneath the Stavely Arc. So we think there's a microcontinental ribbon under there, and that matches a lot of other stuff like the old age of the mantle lithosphere coming up in neovolcanic enclaves brought up from the mantle by the volcanoes kindly for us to study. Now we've got this really hard and fast link, we can start using the change in basin behaviour in South Australia to constrain the early age of the Stavely Arc. There's a really important change between the Normanville group and the Cambrian group, and as Cam has already mentioned, the Cambrian group is the Glen Thompson sandstone underneath the Stavely Arc. It changed from the Normanville group to the Cambrian group with the eruption of the Truro volcanics, which has sort of got a rift character at about 523 plus minus 3. We think this is due to the arc. Okay, so this is why we're drawing our cartoon. We can relate all the bits we can see of the seismic to our cartoon, which is going through the time slice. I'll answer that this afternoon. It looks a little bit like John Foden's cartoon from the geochemistry, so we're on the right track. So this is the area we're talking about. Tasmania is a part of the story. So we've got the Stavely Arc. It's quite strike persistent in mainland Australia. The Mount Reich Arc and the Gidgee Alpha Arc are all part of the same thing, all the same age. So it's sitting along the eastern margin of Gondwana, but there's also this bit out in central Victoria, which is the Jamison volcanics, also the same age, very similar geochemistry. And we can trace that Jamison volcanic stuff down into Western Tassie via coastal exposures and geophysics. And it's offset from Stavely now. But the Mount Reeds are the important thing. I'm not going to dwell on the Mount Reeds. What's interesting about the Mount Reeds is they actually have the same depletion niobium that's really characteristic of subduction-related melts. I'll put the Stavely data on there. It's pretty much the same, and it's also the same age. Interestingly, some of the later volcanics there in the Mount Reeds don't show that depletion, and it suggests that it might be primary, but I'll leave it at that. I think Stavely is a really good opportunity to actually rethink the Mount Reeds. So now we're getting towards the end of the talk now. So this is our 4D time slice for the whole system. Simple passive margin. It was formed during Rodinia breakup and probably had a continental ribbon off the start. It was hyperextended, so there's a mantle peridotite onto the seafloor. And it turns into a convergent margin, probably with subduction migrating in from further south because the Ross orogeny starts older in Antarctica, and that was all part of the story, as you can see in that cartoon. And there's a range of mineral systems that, the place has potential for at that time. I'm not going to dwell on them too much. One thing with the initiation of subduction is that the cold slab's penetrating a hot depleted mantle wedge that's been there for a long time, and that's a viable mechanism to get early bononite. This is an alternative for the sort of island arc continent collision sort of model. And then it matures through time into a calc-alkaline system. And at this time it was going into rollback, and it was a sort of Japan-style system. It looked a bit like this. So it was quite low relief. Most of the arc was probably underwater. Certainly the back arc was, and it was being hyperextended, and it was actually getting hot and melting. And then later on, at some subsequent stage, a microcontinental sliver, which eventually ended up being important parts of Tasmania and central Victoria, was being drawn in a lower plate, and it basically collided into the margin, but it didn't collide in where Stavely is, it collided in further south. So what happened in Stavely is it saw a couple of things, and one was the slab was being held up by the microcontinent, so it was not sinking as fast, so it was shallower, so it was transitioning from a Japan-style system into an Andean-style system, so you're getting upper plate shortening. So the arc's still active, but it's getting all smashed up. Looks like an Andean sort of system. This started about maybe 505, and it went through to about 500, maybe a little bit later. So it would have looked Andean at that stage, same geometry, just different plate sinking versus plate advance scenario. And then the next thing that happened is, with this ingested microcontinent, when subduction stalled on the margin, and it actually jumped outboard to a new arc, and that's the Macquarie Arc. So the birth of the Macquarie Arc sort of marks the death of the Stavely Arc, but they're all a continuum, just in a slightly different spot. But for Stavely, it was really important because it was under convergent stress for maybe 5 million years, and that suppressed magmatism as far as we can tell. And then there was a final release, and that was a pulse magmatism, and that was the mineralised porphyries. And that's sort of the end of the arc. And then after that, the next things that happen are sort of related to the Lachlan Fold Belt, which is shortening between the Selwyn block in Tasmania and the margin. And as it was obliquely moving in, it was squashing the arc and reactivating bits of it, and actually caused the accretionary wedge to reactivate and thrust over the margin. And that formed the Grampians Basin, and that's the cover sequence sitting on top of the arc, mostly eroded away now, fortunately, for explorers, but it's lovely where it still remains. And then ultimately it was formed to its present configuration, and the last deformation is the Delamerian Orogeny, when the orogenic gold was introduced in what was former accretionary wedge in a thick skin sort of process. So that's how we've arrived at our cartoon. Lachlan Fold Belt reworking. This is my afternoon talk. I'm just going to show you what we think happened to the Lachlan Fold Belt after the Benambran. The Macquarie Arc started off simple, and then it went crazy over about a period of 40 million years. And I'll touch on why that happened this afternoon. One of the results is it reactivated the margin by over 100 kilometres, and that's resulted in a lot of the additional complexity. So it got wrenched. And the challenge for us is that, we know we've got Stavely Belt mineralised stuff and we've got Black Range Belt mineralised stuff. They're two small belts. But there's all this other stuff. And based on the limited drilling that's been done, there's a gazillion different interpretations of what different things are. Some of them are arc, some of them aren't arc, some of them are ophiolite, some of them are mantle peridotite, some of them are rift. There's just everything there. So how would you have any confidence as to where to go? That's what this project was about, trying to reduce that uncertainty. So in terms of conclusions, so there's some previous models. We think that they've been invalidated by all the subsequent data we've got, and also the regional context. For the rifted Cordillera model, we think it's the simplest and best for the Stavely Arc geodynamics. It's quite long-lived, and it fits all the data. The arc complex is really strike persistent, but this is the best bit to explore in because it's so shallowly buried. Sorry, New South Wales. The arc evolution involves early trench retreats, so it's Japan-style, VMS, and we have got some VMSs, and this might be the context for them, and there's sort of black shale associated with them. And in South Australia, in Tasmania, that would be called a sort of holy host horizon as an equivalent age time there. And then we think it switches to trench advance and Andean-style, and that was sort of shortening that deformed the arc. And then there was a late tectonic mode switch to transtension, and that was driven by a jump in plate boundary position. That's the last phase, and that's the one with the mineralised porphyries and epithermals. Very significant. The arc's autochthonous to Gondwana, so it formed in situ on Gondwana, and that means that fault slices of all sorts of stuff related to that margin are expected as exotics within the deformed arc succession, and that includes like Glen Thompson sandstone, that's part of it, it's the Cambrian 2 group, but it also includes the serpentinite, and you could even potentially find little bits of meso or Neoproterozoic stuff in there. And it's confusing because of what's happened to it later on, so we'll get to that later on, and that's my talk.